On May 16, 2012, 46-year-old Maya Winters was found stumbling along a deserted mountain trail just outside of town, missing one hand, leaving a dark trail of blood along her path. Disheveled, frail, and visibly shaken, she looked as though she hadn't eaten, drank, or rested in days. One of her hands was missing. Her voice was hoarse as she kept repeating a fractured, haunting story that would leave everyone confused. Paramedics noted her severe dehydration and malnutrition, alongside the fresh trauma to her body. As authorities questioned her, Maya's story sounded like a surreal nightmare. Despite the fragmented details, it hinted at an ordeal beyond explanation. The investigation that followed uncovered strange, inexplicable clues and dead ends, leaving one haunting question. Where had Maya Winters truly been, and what horrors had she survived? Here is her story, told in her own words.
It all started when my husband told me he wanted a divorce. 20 years together, and suddenly he was done, leaving me for someone younger. I believed we were forever, but now I felt like I'd lost everything we built and everything I thought I knew about love. Then I lost my job. 10 years of loyalty ended with a layoff notice and a pat on the back. I felt hollow, as if someone had ripped my life away piece by piece. My health suffered too. A routine checkup revealed I had hypertension. The stress was relentless, wrapping tighter around me every day. I felt empty, like I was watching my life from the outside. I knew I needed a way out. One night, after too much cheap red wine, I was scrolling through Instagram, tears still wet on my cheeks. Amid the blur, an ad for a wellness retreat caught my eye. Pictures of serene mountains, people meditating near waterfalls, and a cozy log cabin promising peace. Desperation overcame me, and I clicked sign up. I didn't tell anyone about the retreat. I wanted to heal on my own terms, away from pitying glances. On the morning I left, I let my sister know I was going away for 2 weeks and asked if she could drive me there. She agreed, but was clearly worried, which I tried to brush off. As we drove through the winding roads, I asked her to drop me off a little way before the retreat itself, at a spot close but hidden from view. I told her I wanted to walk the rest of the way, claiming it would give me a moment to gather myself. She looked hesitant, but finally pulled over, giving me a long hug before I reassured her again and stepped out of the car. I watched her drive off, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, surrounded by thick trees and the looming mountain beyond. The air was fresh and carried a strange stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Taking a deep breath, I turned toward the path and began the final stretch on foot, trying to shake the strange chill that had crept up my spine. As I came closer, the retreat's beauty took me by surprise. Nestled in the mountains, it looked like something out of a postcard. Lush greenery, towering pines swaying in the breeze, and the distant sound of a waterfall. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of wildflowers, and I felt for the first time that this might be exactly what I needed. The charming log cabin welcomed me, sunlight streaming through large windows. Residents strolled along the paths, their faces glowing with contentment. They smiled at me, and I couldn't help but smile back, even though a nagging voice in my mind whispered that something felt a bit off. A staff member approached, welcoming me with a serene demeanor. It all felt surreal, like stepping into a different world. I noticed the walls adorned with tranquil artwork depicting landscapes that seemed almost alive. They asked me to submit my phone and laptop to create an environment free from distractions. I hesitated, but it made sense. I was here to disconnect and find myself again. I handed over my devices, shrugging off the strange feeling creeping in. The room they led me to was cozy and well decorated, with a stunning view of the mountains. I took a deep breath, hoping to inhale some of the serenity surrounding me. Maybe I could finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. Yet as the door closed behind me, the sense of peace began to feel like a fragile veneer, covering something deeper that I couldn't quite identify. I shook my head, determined to push away any lingering doubts. I was here to heal, and I refused to let my past cloud this moment. The first few days at the resort felt almost too peaceful, as if I'd stepped into some dream that was intentionally made to be soothing. The meals arrived on time, beautifully prepared, and almost too perfect. The rooms were pristine, and everywhere I looked, the mountains framed the sky in shades of green and blue. It felt like the kind of tranquility I'd been craving. But on the fourth day, something shifted. At first, it was just a sense that the other residents didn't seem to sleep. Every time I stepped outside my room, whether morning or evening, they were there, lounging on the deck or walking the gardens. They moved with a sense of repetition, almost like they were on a loop. It became unsettling how familiar their faces and gestures felt, like I was watching the same scene over and over again. I tried talking to a woman who always sat on a bench near the garden's edge, reading the same book every time I saw her. I asked her how long she'd been here, if she was enjoying her stay. She barely looked up, giving me short, almost robotic answers. Yes, I love it here. I want to stay here forever. Her voice had a flatness to it that chilled me. Each answer felt practiced, stripped of any warmth or personality. She didn't ask me anything in return, didn't even seem interested in continuing the conversation, as if it was more of a duty than an interaction. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, strange little details started slipping into my day, like moments that didn't quite add up. One afternoon, I looked at the clock hanging above the fireplace in the lounge. It read 2 p.m. I glanced away for what felt like seconds, but when I looked back, it was already 4 p.m. Hours seemed to slip away without explanation, and I found myself questioning if I'd truly lost track of time or if something was tampering with it. Doubt started creeping in, my suspicions growing by the day, but each time I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that it was all in my head. The eerie feeling of something wrong lingered, tightening its grip around me. I couldn't shake the sense that something was off, that the tranquility I'd come searching for had taken on a sinister edge. That night, after everyone had settled in, I decided it was time to find out what was going on. At midnight, when the resort seemed blanketed in silence, I slipped out of my room. The hallways, so bright and welcoming during the day, were now cast in shadow. The few dim lights lining the walls made everything appear warped and unreal, like I'd stepped into another version of this place. It struck me then that this was the first time I'd seen it after dark, and there was something deeply unsettling about it. As I walked, an eerie feeling wrapped around me, growing heavier with each step. Just then, faint whispers filled the silence. They were so soft I almost doubted my own ears. But as they grew louder, I realized I wasn't imagining it. They seemed to say my name, Maya. But each time I turned to look, the hallway behind me was empty. The whispers died away as suddenly as they'd come, leaving me even more unnerved, but I kept going. Eventually, I reached the kitchen. The room was pitch black as I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the air thick and still. My hand brushed against cold metal as I stumbled forward, blindly searching the walls for a light switch. My fingers finally found one, and I flicked it on, blinking against the sudden brightness. But what I saw didn't make any sense. The kitchen I'd seen during the day was a bustling, orderly space. Now it was barren. The counters and cabinets were stripped bare. No pots, no pans, no sign of any food. Instead, rows and rows of small bottles lined the shelves, each labelled with chemical names I didn't recognise. Syringes, pill containers and vials glinted under the harsh light, giving the room a sterile, clinical look that sent a chill down my spine. Heart pounding, I noticed another door tucked away at the far end of the kitchen. It was plain, barely visible, and almost as if it didn't belong, but a small sign above it read, "Basement." As I pushed open the basement door, a wave of stale, cold air rolled over me, thick with a stench so foul it made my stomach turn. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended, each step sinking me deeper into an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the light from above. Suddenly something brushed against my face, a thin, silken thread that startled me so badly I gasped aloud. My heart raced as I reached up, grasping the thread. It felt old and frayed, like a forgotten relic left to collect dust in the dark. I tugged gently, and with a soft click, a single dim bulb sputtered to life above me, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scene, and what it illuminated was enough to freeze my blood. The floor was smeared with dark, congealed stains, and as I ventured further, I realized they were dried pools of blood, so much blood that it stained the walls, splattered high and thick as if from a violent struggle. Tables and chairs were overturned, some shattered, with deep claw-like gouges marking the walls. Then in the half-light, I saw them, piles of bodies, limp and distorted, stacked like discarded mannequins. Their faces, frozen in expressions of terror, were barely human, their skin pale and waxy, limbs twisted and bent. The hollow eyes stared blankly at me, their mouths open as if caught in endless silent screams. My stomach churned, and the metallic taste of bile rose in my throat. A scraping sound made me whirl around, my pulse hammering. Somewhere in the dark, something moved, dragging itself forward with agonizing slowness. I squinted, and there, just beyond the light's reach, was a figure, a man or something that had once been a man, his face hollow, pale skin stretched taut across gaunt cheekbones. He moved with a jerking, unnatural motion, like a puppet pulled on invisible strings, and the moment he saw me, his eyes fixed with a glint of malice. He crawled toward me, nails scraping across the floor, leaving a dark, wet trail in his wake. I turned to run, but behind me, another figure emerged from the shadows blocking the stairs, a woman, her skin blackened and charred, lips cracked and split to reveal a grotesque, crooked smile. She reached out with skeletal fingers and I stumbled backward, heart hammering as the smell of burning flesh filled my nostrils. Then, as if sparked by some invisible force, flames erupted across the walls of the basement. They licked up hungrily, spreading from the floor to the ceiling with unnatural speed. The air grew thick with smoke, choking and acrid, and the flames illuminated the horrors around me in an orange glow that made the bodies seem to writhe, as if they were trapped in eternal torment. I staggered backward, covering my mouth, but the smoke was relentless. My eyes watered as I clawed my way up the stairs, desperate for air. The kitchen, too, was engulfed in flames, swallowing everything in its path. The fire seemed alive, roaring and crackling, closing in around me, sending waves of unbearable heat that blistered my skin. I stumbled into the hallway, coughing, eyes stinging, but the smoke was everywhere. I tried to call out, to warn the others, but the smoke was too thick. My voice came out as a whisper, swallowed up in the flames. My vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges. I could barely make out the walls of the hallway melting in the heat, twisting and warping as if they too were alive. The last thing I felt was a searing pain in my lungs, the taste of ash and blood in my mouth, and then nothing. The world went dark, and I fell, swallowed up by the flames. When I finally opened my eyes, a blinding white filled my vision. I blinked, disoriented, until the blur sharpened, and I saw that I was in a bed covered in crisp white sheets, the room around me pristine and sanitized. For a moment, I thought I was in a hospital, until I recognized the walls and layout. This was the kitchen, but it had been transformed. There was no sign of the fire, no smoke or soot, just the clinical sterility of white walls and cold fluorescent lights. As my vision cleared, I noticed a group of people standing by the foot of my bed, their expressions unreadable as they murmured to each other in low voices. Words drifted through my fogged mind, phrases I struggled to understand. She cannot escape. Wait for her to wake up. My pulse quickened, and I shut my eyes tightly, pretending I was still unconscious, my heart hammering as I lay perfectly still. I focused on the sound of their shuffling footsteps as they slowly left the room, one by one. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I sat up, my skin prickling with horror. The entire kitchen was lined with rows of identical white beds, each one occupied by a person lying perfectly still, eerily silent, their faces pale and lifeless. The rows stretched on, each bed a grim echo of mine, each face frozen in that same unnatural, unbroken sleep. Panic surged through me, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was happening in this place was beyond sinister. I scanned the room desperately and noticed an open window, slightly ajar. My heart leapt at the sight, and with as much stealth as I could muster, I slipped out of bed, creeping toward it. I lunged for the open window, heart pounding. Just as I thought I was free, a hand grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back. I turned to see one of the residents standing right there, a dead look in his eyes, his lips stretched into a sick, twisted grin, and before I knew what was happening, he pulled out a knife. I fought, thrashing and kicking, but his grip tightened, locking my arm in place. Then he raised the knife and swung it down, straight onto my wrist. I felt the blade cut through, a white-hot pain ripping through me, followed by the wet, sickening crunch of bone. I screamed, watching in horror as blood gushed from the stump where my hand had been, dripping down onto the garden grass in thick, dark pools. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding arm, barely able to stay upright. I couldn't even process the pain. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me from collapsing right there. Somehow, I forced myself to turn and crawl through the window, landing hard on the ground outside. The grass was cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the burning agony in my arm. I staggered to my feet, bleeding heavily, and started stumbling toward the main gate, each step a struggle. As I looked around, I could feel them. All the residents out there in the garden turning slowly to watch me, their empty eyes tracking my every move. They started to close in, their heads tilting as if curious, each step perfectly in sync with the others. Panic surged and I broke into a run. Behind me I could hear them speeding up, their footsteps closing in as I pushed myself forward, tears streaming down my face, lungs burning. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept running, blood dripping from my wrist and leaving a trail, knowing that if I slowed down, even for a second, they'd be on me. The gate came into view, and I threw myself toward it, barely making it out just as the night swallowed me whole. I didn't dare look back. I simply kept running, letting my fear propel me forward, escaping from whatever nightmare I had stepped into. As I stumbled through the darkness, a police car pulled up, lights flashing. An officer stepped out, raising a hand to stop me, his expression both concerned and wary. Breathless and desperate, I tried to blurt out everything in a panic, holding up my hand for them to see. Seeing the blood dripping from my wrist, the officer quickly called for medical assistance. As paramedics arrived and bandaged my wound, I recounted my story to them, my voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. The officers listened closely, their faces grave as they processed every word. Finally, the officer closest to me nodded slowly, gesturing toward the back seat of the car. "Miss, please just take a seat," he said calmly, avoiding my eyes. Exhausted, I climbed in, my mind racing as I tried to process their reaction. The officer climbed in the driver's seat and after a long, tense silence spoke softly. "What you're saying, it can't be possible. That resort burned down years ago. There's nothing left but ruins." I sat there, frozen, his words ringing in my ears. It couldn't be true. What I'd just experienced and the people I'd seen, all of it had been real. I'd touched them, spoken to them. But as we drove up the winding path back toward the mountains, my heart sank. In the dim glow of the police car's headlights, I saw it. The building I'd stayed in, the beautiful retreat that had felt like a sanctuary just days before, was nothing more than a scorched, skeletal ruin. The officer got out and opened my door, watching me closely as I stepped onto the crumbling ground, still staring at the remains of the building in disbelief. None of it made sense. Everything I'd seen, everyone I'd spoken to, it all felt as vivid as any other memory. But now, as I stood before the ashen ruin, the reality settled over me, heavy and cold. The resort had been gone for years.
To this day, Maya Winters remains unwavering in her belief that everything she experienced at the wellness resort was real. Authorities initially dismissed her story as the result of trauma or hallucination, but a series of troubling discoveries cast doubt on any easy explanation. When investigators searched her belongings, they found an ID card identical to those issued by the retreat before it burned down, bearing a stamp in a rare ink formulation exclusive to the resort and no longer available anywhere else. Adding to the mystery, medical staff noted a faint barcode tattoo and a brand-like mark on her neck, both identical to the ones given to the retreat's guests, though Maya insisted she'd never had them before. But the most baffling part of the story was when officers contacted Maya's sister. When she received the call from the police to tell her that Maya was in an ambulance taken to a hospital, she was shocked. She told the police that she was still driving back home from having dropped Maya at the retreat. It was at most 2 hours since she last saw her. For more horror scary stories, please subscribe.